Welcome back to our unit on ancient Greece. Today we're going to look at the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle was born sometime around 384 BC. Now, he was a student of Plato and became the teacher and tutor of Alexander the Great. And in this way, he exercised a great deal of influence. Also, Aristotle was the author of many books and was perhaps the most learned and educated man of his day. Ultimately, Aristotle became one of Greece's most influential philosophers, not only in his own day, but in our day as well. Now, Plato was born in Macedonia, not Athens, and he was born to the personal physician to the king of Macedonia. Now, unfortunately, both of his parents died when he was about 13 years old. As a result of that, Aristotle was raised by a guardian. Now, due to his father's connections and wealth, it is very likely that Aristotle spent a significant amount of time as a child in the royal palace of Macedonia and made important connections with the Macedonian royal family. These connections would later prove very beneficial to him as his career was getting off to a start. Now, when he was about 18 years old, Aristotle moved to Athens and enrolled in the school that Plato had established. Here in Athens, he learned from Plato. He attended Plato's school for nearly 20 years until about 348 BC. This was about a year after Plato had died. He left Plato's school only after Plato had died, leaving the school to his cousin. Now, according to tradition, Aristotle was disappointed in the direction that the school took after Plato's cousin took over the school. Now, it's also possible that he left Athens in order to escape some anti-Macedonian feelings in Athens that were increasing at this time because of the actions of one Philip of Macedon. We'll learn about Philip a little bit later. Now, in 343, Aristotle was invited by Philip of Macedon, who had now become king, to become the personal tutor of his son and heir, a boy named Alexander. Aristotle traveled to Pella, the capital of Macedonia, where he was appointed as the head of the Royal Academy of Macedon. As Alexander's tutor, Aristotle was very influential in the life of the future king of Macedon. He taught Alexander about Greek history, culture, and philosophy. He also encouraged Alexander to pursue a military campaign against the Persian Empire. Remember that the Greeks didn't like the Persians very much. But it appears that Aristotle had a very deep prejudice against the Persians and believed that it was Alexander's right to spread Greek culture to the east. In fact, at one time he told Alexander to be, quote, a leader to the Greeks and a despot to the barbarians, by which he meant Persians, and to look after the former as after friends and relatives, and to deal with the latter as with beasts or plants, unquote. Clearly, Aristotle had a problem with the Persians. Now, in 335 BC, Alexander took the Macedonian army and Greek forces to invade Persia. Since Alexander no longer needed a tutor, Aristotle left Pella and returned to Athens, where he started his own school, known as the Lyceum. This school became very famous and was known for its excellent library, as well as for its excellent teaching. It didn't hurt that Aristotle was the headmaster. Now, it is believed that Aristotle wrote most of his books between the period of 335 BC and 323 BC, while he was running the Lyceum in Athens. Aristotle's studies covered a broad range of subjects, including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, and government. He must have been very busy all the time. These studies created the first comprehensive system of Western philosophy that had ever been written down. Now, although Aristotle originally was in harmony with Plato and appeared to follow his teachings and philosophy, at some time Aristotle diverged from Plato and identified his own approach to philosophy. Now, we can see this in a number of things that both Plato and Aristotle wrote. For example, Aristotle believed that truth could be discerned from observing nature. This approach is called an empirical approach. Under an empirical approach, a careful observation of natural phenomena and events reveals the nature and character of a particular thing. This approach is different from Plato's ideas, which believed that things had a universal form and that nature conformed to the form. And this form was a truth that was revealed by God rather than observed by man. Now, Aristotle also believed that students can learn any knowledge by applying hard work, study, etc. to any subject. This could include music, mathematics, art, etc. Now, again, this is a different idea from Plato's approach, which seems to have followed the ideas of Socrates in believing that knowledge could not be learned, but was instead a divinely inspired gift to particular men. Aristotle also virtually invented the study of logic, creating the first systematic approach to defining how logic operated and how logic can lead to good and critical thinking. In fact, Aristotle believed that using logic could lead to truth. For example, one famous syllogism or logical paradigm that Aristotle came up with is this: all men are mortal. Aristotle is a man. Therefore, Aristotle is mortal. Now, although this logic may appear basic to us today, it provided a groundbreaking foundation towards reasoning based on empirical knowledge and information rather than basing conclusions on a predetermined idea. In essence, what Aristotle was doing was reasoning from the specific information to the general. Aristotelian logic is still an important branch of study for anyone interested in critical thinking and logical thinking today. Now, another place where Plato and Aristotle differed was in their approach to politics. Aristotle thought of politics as being like a living organism rather than like a machine, sort of like a collection of parts, none of which can exist without the others. Think about yourself. Your hand can't exist without the rest of the body. Now, note that this idea is different than Plato, who believed that a wise philosopher king could independently and pretty much all by himself create the ideal city. Now, although Aristotle was aware of the existence and potential of larger empires, he believed that the natural community was the city, the polis, which functions as a political community or partnership of individuals. The goal of this ideal city is not just to avoid injustice or to create economic stability, things which every city wants to accomplish, but rather it was also to allow at least some of the citizens the possibility to live a good life and to perform what Aristotle called beautiful acts. Aristotle said, quote, "The political partnership must be regarded, therefore, as being for the sake of noble actions, not for the sake of living together," unquote. Now, Aristotle also came up with the idea of the anacyclosis, or cycle of government, which you've already learned about. In this cycle, governments run through different forms of government based off of internal conflict and weaknesses inherent in the form of government. Now, unlike Plato, Aristotle did not believe that the cycle of government was a downward spiral unless it was governed by a philosopher king. Instead, Aristotle felt that governments could harness the weaknesses of governmental forms in order to create stability and provide opportunities for some men to create beautiful acts. Now, following the death of Alexander the Great, Aristotle came under increasing pressure from anti-Macedonian groups within Athens. Like Socrates, Aristotle was ultimately accused of impiety because of his teachings and belief that the Greek gods were not the answer to all questions. However, unlike Socrates, Aristotle fled Athens rather than stand trial. Aristotle is quoted as having said, quote, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," unquote. Aristotle died in Euboea of natural causes in about 322 BC. Now, in his will, he asked to be buried next to his wife. This was something that was unusual in Greek society. Now, more than 2,300 years have passed since his death, but Aristotle remains one of the most influential people who have ever lived. He contributed to almost every field of human knowledge in existence, and he was the founder of many new fields. According to one modern scholar, it is, quote, "doubtful whether any human being has ever known as much as he did," unquote. Aristotle was very influential throughout the Greek world and into the Roman period. However, following the fall of the Roman Empire, Aristotle was virtually unknown in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. His fame and studies were kept alive only in the Islamic Middle East and Byzantium. So the people in Europe, the people in what later became the heart of Western civilization, didn't even know about Aristotle. Now, following the Crusades, European crusaders brought copies of some of Aristotle's books back to Europe, where they were translated into Latin and distributed widely. Aristotle, as a result, had a significant impact on the Renaissance and philosophical learning up into the modern age. Aristotle is still very relevant today. Unfortunately, many of the books written by Aristotle no longer exist. They were lost or destroyed in the years following his death and just before their revival at the time of the Renaissance. We know of the books only through references in other writings by other scholars and through references in Aristotle's own works. Now, given his impressive impact on philosophy, science, politics, rhetoric, art, and drama, and other things, we can only wonder what impact he would have had if all of his works had survived. Now, in this chapter, we learned about Aristotle and how he influenced one of the greatest rulers in history, Alexander the Great. We also looked at Aristotle's philosophy, studies, and writing, and how these studies have impacted our modern world. In our next chapter, we will begin looking at Alexander the Great and how he became one of the greatest rulers in all of history. We will start with the life of his father, Philip of Macedon.